Modules to this regulation module with me alone, and John Asker had some flight troubles. He's arriving later today. So the plan for these sort of 5 or 6 sessions. So today I'm going to do a high-level overview of regulation, and there's sort of a bunch of subtopics of regulation, and then there's sort of canonical theory models for each one of those. So I'm going to try to hit all of those and then show you in one particular industry over 40, 50 years how all of these things came into play in that industry. Okay? But really the purpose is to set the stage. This is going to be very general, some sort of unrealistic theory models just to fix ideas. Ideas to set the stage for more specialized empirical papers, which is like what the rest of this sessions will be on. Okay, so John and Alon will talk about mergers and product variety. John will talk about collusion. Alon will also talk about collusion, but like specific, sort of more similar to the models, the type of style that Robin was presenting yesterday. Then I'll do the same thing for monopoly and environmental regulation. Okay, so regulation, we got to define it if we're going to talk about it. And the best, I looked around how people define it, and I thought, introspected a bit. I came up with this very broad definition as the practice of government exerting partial control on the behavior of firms. So like anything the government does that sort of restricts what firms can do, which is very general, very broad. Sort of specific actions that fall under the study of regulation would be rate setting, like the government says, okay, you can charge this much. Taxation, like cap and trade programs or pollution taxation. Product standards, your cars have to have this level of emissions at least, or at most. Requirements to serve, you have to build your electricity network to meet everyone, all the houses. Merger control I put under regulation. You can do this merger, you can't do that merger. Limitations on communication or contracts. Really here I'm alluding to restrictions on collusion or restrictions of competition that are implemented through communication or through like exclusive contracts, for example, as well as government ownership of enterprise. Like if the electricity company is owned by the government, then I put that in the world of regulation. In many of these markets, the government that these apply to, the government is the buyer of the services. So like in Medicare, okay, the government's the largest buyer of the services, but a lot of these aren't. Like in electricity, it's just houses and households and businesses. Okay, so the goal of doing all this stuff in principle is to correct market failures and increase social welfare. That's what the goal ought to be, let's say. But achieving these goals is limited in practice by a bunch of factors that sort of economists and practitioners have identified. First, you're dealing with firms who are large and sophisticated and can react in complex ways, and that's hard to map out. Okay, so that's sort of the modeling. They have market power. 2, the firms you're regulating often know more about their line of business than you do, okay, which makes it difficult to fully correct all the market failures. You can do some stuff, but not get all the way. When you think about dynamics that these regulations are going to hold over time, there ends up being the sort of dynamic where you put in a regulation today. If you could commit to hold that forever, you'd be happy, okay, but like once some other stuff has happened, you want to change your regulation, and the firms realize that, so they react, and then that makes it difficult to implement the first best as well. And then the regulators have their own incentives. So it could be political, so they favor some constituencies over other constituencies. It could be that they're corrupt, so they favor themselves over social welfare and so on. Okay, so we're going to look at a bunch of empirical papers that look at these constraints either in merger control, in economic regulation, environmental regulation, or collusion. Okay, so let's say within I/O, I could identify 3 sort of umbrellas of regulation. The first is antitrust regulation. Okay, and what's specific to antitrust regulation is that it applies to basically all sectors. Okay, compared to, we're going to talk about economic regulation, which is very sector specific. Okay, so these are rules that apply to all sectors, limits on who can merge with who, and also coordination between firms and price fixing or otherwise, as well as contracts that lead to monopolization or abusive dominance. So those all go under the sorts of things that the DOJ would enforce in the US. And then another umbrella is what I call economic regulation. These are where the government takes a specific sector and really tailors the rules to that sector. Okay, so like in electricity distribution, natural gas distribution, water distribution, the post office, In the U.S. previously, historically in airlines, trucking, the government would either fully or partially control prices. They tell you what products to produce, give you parameter constraints on that, how much to invest, what investments are appropriate. Typically, in the U.S., these are still private firms providing the service. Okay, but if you look around the world, there's also many government firms. Okay, highly tailored rules and big regulatory apparatuses, like specific departments that are dedicated to one industry or one sector. Okay, so the examples I mentioned, railroads is another big one, still regulated. And then there's other examples like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. regulating the banking system. That's not as tight regulation as, say, the electricity distribution sector. Okay, but there's sort of a softer set of rules, but it still goes on there. And healthcare with the Medicare and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Okay, then there's another umbrella which we think of when we think of regulation, which is environmental and safety regulation. So things like limits on emissions, the CAFE standards for cars in the U.S., taxes or cap and trade systems, restrictions on product design. So those are the three umbrellas we're going to look at. The boundaries are blurry, and some institutions operate in multiple of these domains. So if you think about energy and transportation markets, it's often a mix of economic regulation and environmental regulation. We're actually going to look at one specific paper which looks at the interaction of those two and how in a world where it's easy to solve the environmental problem absent economic regulation, once you put economic regulation in, it becomes more complicated. Okay, and in antitrust, one thing we'll talk about are merger remedies. So that is, the government lets you merge, but it says you can only, once you merge, you have to follow these rules. Okay, so that introduces an aspect of economic regulation into antitrust regulation. Okay, I just want to go, yes, please.
Why you don't see enforcement of contracts or rules against cheating in bargaining as a kind of regulation?
I would put those, so like this definition would include that, and so I can't deny that. And there's other things this definition would include, like building a road would sort of affect what firms could do, and that's in the government. Those don't traditionally fall under what economists call regulation, or what. So it's a bit of like, I know it when I see it, but this is the best way I could organize it so far. Okay, we're gonna get to theory and economics, but I just want to give you a little bit more sense of how this stuff works in practice, because it's important for thinking about the theory. Okay, so in the U.S. Antitrust enforcement, there's many agencies which enforce it. Okay, from the DOJ and FTC, who both they have a shared mandate to evaluate mergers. So there's some conflict there. States themselves, because the federal system can challenge mergers, and often they have the same position, or they can have different positions from the DOJ. Industry regulators like the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Aviation Administration can also block mergers in their own industries, and you can also have private action where another firm sues alleging a violation of the antitrust laws. For economic regulation, this depends on sort of the industry. The electricity and water is usually at the state level by public utility commissions. Okay, and there's also for electricity lines that cross state boundaries, there's a federal commission. Okay, then you have federal industry-specific commissions like the Postal Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, so on. Okay, and environmental regulation, again, EPA is the big one at the federal level, but you'll see a lot of economic papers talking about CARB. Okay, I kept hearing CARB and wondering what it was when I was a student. That's the California Air Resources Board, who also puts a lot of environmental regulations. Okay, so all of these, they have a common history, okay, which was, just very briefly, in the mid to late 1800s, technology changed in such a way that firms got really big in the U.S. Okay, so you had like the U.S. Steel, Standard Oil. These were, commanding 90+% market shares. There's very little regulation, and furthermore, at the same time, there were sort of increases in democracy that made government more responsive to consumers' concerns. So that led to laws. The first one was in the railroad industry. Okay, in Massachusetts actually, where they put a commission that was looking at the railroad industry. That led to the Interstate Commerce Act, which subjected railroads to economic regulation. They started saying, railroads, you can charge this much, but not this much. Okay. Just a little bit later, you got the Sherman Act, which one thing, so by the way, I should mention, okay, Mike didn't tell me to do this. You should all pick up his book on antitrust economics. Okay, it's a really nice really nice book, and a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about and my thoughts are influenced by that book. Okay, so the Sherman Act is this legislation which had this very vague prohibition on contracts and combinations which restrain trade. Okay, so like what does that mean? We're going to be talking about that. And then after that, there's a whole slew. Each one of these is like major landmark laws in the U.S. which fundamentally reshaped those industries over a long time, and then all the case law and court precedents that come on. Okay, so it's a complicated apparatus for actually, we're going to look at we're going to go into simple theory models like Cournot oligopoly and thinking about merger there, but when you think about like porting that knowledge to reality, there's all these other stuff that you got to think about. Okay, so now we're going to, under those same umbrellas, we're going to look at the canonical theory models. For merger analysis, we're going to think about market power versus efficiencies. Okay, and we're going to talk about an early Williamson paper. It's pretty simple. And then this Farrell-Shapiro analysis in the AER about mergers and Cournot oligopoly. For collusion, the paper, sort of my starting point for collusion, other people might have other ideas, is Green and Porter paper in Econometrica, 1984. And for economic regulation, for the asymmetric information side, there's this Barron and Meyerson paper, one of the first applications of mechanism design. So we'll go through the setup and main results for each of these. And we'll talk also about time inconsistency and subgame perfection. Okay. Very broad. Okay, so when you hear people say the Williamson trade-off, that's Oliver Williamson, a paper, I think 1968, where it's a very simple notion, that paper, where he said, look, when you're looking at a merger, there's good stuff and bad stuff that happens out of the merger. Okay, and the good stuff we call efficiencies, and the bad stuff we call sort of increases in market power. If you think about a horizontal merger between two competitors, like Coke and Pepsi were to merge with each other, you'd think like a market power effect would be they have incentive to raise prices because they face less competition. They might share best practices and have an incentive to lower prices because they have lower marginal costs, and even a monopoly would lower prices with lower marginal costs. They could have fixed cost savings that allow their resources to be utilized elsewhere in the economy. Okay, they might have an incentive to offer different sets of products, like maybe eliminate diet, I don't know, who knows. And that can have ambiguous, yes, please.
So whenever we say that bad effect, so it's from the consumer's point of view, like in
This is a debate. So people debate whether should we be trying to maximize social welfare, consumer welfare? I think in the U.S., Mike would know more, is they've settled on consumer welfare as a first. But then they talk about fixed cost in the merger cases. So it's like a little bit of a dichotomy there, yeah.
They don't consider employment, for example?
I'm going to talk about that later. Yes. Oh, sorry. Repeat the questions. Yeah. So the question was, do merger authorities consider employment when approving or blocking a merger? I would say in practice, not really, at least not explicitly. But there's a debate, especially with increasing inequality, whether they should or not. Okay. Is my reading of the state of affairs. Okay, and then there's additional stuff like investments can change and so on. So we're going to look at empirical papers which try to tackle each one of, or some subset of these. Okay, so this is a figure I stole from Mike's, I took from Mike's book, Williamson trade-off. So if you think about a competitive equilibrium, so here's the marginal cost pre-merger, okay, where it hits the demand curve, and thinking about a merger that's going to raise price to P prime, okay, but lower cost to C prime. Okay, so we're basically comparing the deadweight loss from the merger to the efficiencies, okay, the market power versus efficiencies. Okay, and then here it's sort of, Mike, I don't know if that quote goes back further than you, but the quote in the book is that rectangles are bigger than triangles. Does it go back further, or is that, no, okay, it's an original? Okay. Okay, but that's where you're starting from a competitive price. Okay, if you look at starting from a industry where there's already market power, okay, so you're not at the competitive, your initial allocations here, okay, and we're thinking about moving to P prime here, there's sort of a larger shape here to compare to the rectangle. Okay, so what we're trying to do when we think about a merger is measure these blocks. Okay, I would say we're a little bit better at measuring these because there's more data on these. Okay, it's harder to predict these. But even this is not, it's not trivial. Okay, there's a lot of issues in doing this. Yes?
In the previous graph, so the C prime is like arbitrary, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But the P prime isn't.
Well, I wouldn't say, okay, no. So I mean, for the purposes of making this figure, this isn't from any real data. Neither of them are from real data.
Yeah.
Okay, so
No.
you can make P prime up here.
Yeah, but you could derive P prime from monopoly theory, but C prime you have no way to derive, right? From like basic.
Yes, though to divide P prime, you'd have to know C prime, right, to do it. So, yeah. So I'm not trying to, this is not a result, right? This is just the. Okay, and that's a horizontal merger. And you can think about a vertical merger, which Robin talked, I think, very nicely about yesterday. There you have the reduction of double marginalization, which you consider potentially an efficiency, holding the set of products fixed. Incentive to raise prices or exclude rivals, which would be a market power effect. Okay, then you have changing investment incentives, which are, I would say, ambiguous or unknown. Okay, we haven't really nailed those. Okay, and those are for mergers, but the same sorts of trade-offs come up with different types of contracts. Okay, sort of good things and bad things that we're trying to measure. Okay, so this is a paper in the AER. It's a very simple setup. It kind of surprised me that it wasn't written until 1990. It's a Cornell oligopoly, homogeneous goods. It's general in the sense that it's not the Cornell oligopoly that you see in your first undergraduate industrial organization course, because it has general cost functions, okay, and general demand functions. Okay, there's some conditions to make the equilibrium well behaved, but it's not like linear. The analysis is not restricted to linear demand or anything like that. Okay, so each firm has their own cost function, potentially nonlinear. Homogeneous goods, so you have the industry inverse demand function. Each firm's maximizing profits. Okay, so they choose their own QI. Okay, they impose some mild conditions on P and C's to make the equilibrium well behaved and unique. Okay, so what they want to do is just in this simple setup say what happens when two firms merge. What happens to social welfare? What happens to consumer welfare? Okay, it seems like it shouldn't be that difficult to do, but it turns out it is actually kind of tricky. Okay, with the generality of the cost functions. So they model a merger as a combination of firms J and K into a single firm M with this new cost function Cm of Qm. Okay, right now unrestricted, but we're going to talk about how that cost function relates to Cj and Ck to think about what an efficiency. Okay, well here we say a merger creates synergies. Synergies is another word for efficiencies. If M has production possibilities that are better than J and K jointly. Okay, so if I want to produce Qm quantity, if I prior to the merger allocated that Qm amongst J and K in a way that got me to Qm, okay, at the lowest cost, we're going to say there's efficiencies if Cm does that even lower than that. Okay, so with linear or with constant marginal costs, this would be if the new firm's marginal cost is lower than the minimum of the previous firm's marginal cost. Okay, so their first result, which is I think intuitive, is that if a merger generates no synergies, then it causes prices to rise. Okay, so mergers will be bad for consumers if there are no synergies, because in this model, consumers only care about prices. It's homogeneous goods. But even there, we don't know, could they increase total welfare? Okay, because the firms might be better off. Okay, and again, in this model, very simple. Homogeneous goods, Cournot. Okay, we're ignoring product assortment, investment. Yes? Yeah.
Could you go back to the previous, that
Mm-hmm.
last inequality? Where are those potential synergies coming from? They don't seem to be reflected in the cost function. The best the two firms could do together is, in fact, that minimum.
Well, not necessarily. I think they could, if they say they share best practice and there's some complementarity between best practices, you could get a lower marginal cost.
But shouldn't that be captured in the cost function? Best practices?
That's in the CM function.
Yeah, but why isn't it?
With fixed
why isn't it reflected in CJ and CK?
Why is it reflected in CJ and CK? It's just, and this is a totally new function, right? This could live totally underneath CJ and CK.
But it still depends on what the two firms do, right?
Yeah, there's something about, it's like, imagine this is a new factory that's much more efficient, right? That could,
But they couldn't have built that factory before?
not in this definition of synergies. This is like holding, yeah.
So just maybe on that point,
This one's not about fixed costs. This is about marginal cost.
Well, is that really what you want to do?
Um,
Fixed cost or marginal?
I guess, okay, so this is general enough to allow for fixed costs. It turns out what's important for prices is obviously marginal cost. But
It depends if you're allowing for entry and stuff like that.
yeah, in the sort of fixed, yeah.
so just to like on that point, could it be possible that say J has a higher fixed cost but lower variable cost, and K has the reverse, and if they merge, then their total cost?
But that would come out from the minimization. They just reallocate.
Yeah, oh, you're right.
So this is
Right.
an improvement beyond that.
Well, actually,
Right.
But maybe, firm K knows something, but J doesn't know, J knows something, K doesn't know, and put that together.
yeah, that's the idea.
You get
Or another thing that was alluded to yesterday is when J and K merge, they might be negotiating with the supplier and get an even lower
Can I ask-
marginal cost. Yeah.
Are you going to do an allocation effect separately? It could be that QJ and QBK are not efficient. That if I was a monopoly, I would, with the given cost functions, I would do it differently.
Yeah. So this is for QM, for some QM. Okay. In equilibrium, they're going to choose QM to maximize their.
So no,
Profits.
I'm asking a different question, which is, you're defining synergies as you minimize over QJ and QK for the first part.
This is
I'm
for
saying- So there's a separate allocational effect. The market might not give you the
Ariel?
efficient. Yes.
That's the theorem. It's like that's not enough to lead to lower prices.
Yes, but this is the definition of efficiencies. Then, when all is said and done,
There's
So I'm
something that-
asking a separate question. Is there a separate,
Yeah, you could potentially have production reallocate. I mean,
Yes.
Cornell,
Yes.
before there isn't.
yes, that's why I asked.
And, so it's not, quantities are not allocated.
I didn't get the question actually. And I should repeat it as
There's
well.
an allocational effect
Yes.
of the merger as
But
well.
but
Yeah.
that's the minimization that you just doing. That's the reallocation.
This is after the reallocation. That
Can you go back to the,
this is a definition of what it means for there to be synergies in the merger.
but you're minimizing over QJ and QK.
Yes.
So in the
Such that they-
actuality, before the merger, it's not the minimum.
That's
This,
right.
this QJ and QK are such that they equal QM.
So one way.
This has nothing to do with the pre-merger QJ and
Right,
QK.
One way you can get an improvement
Is there an allocation?
is just through reallocation. That's the
what I'm
minimum.
saying.
Yes.
But
Yes, that's-
Ali is saying you can do better than that.
Yes, I understand that. But there
And
is
that's
two-
what I was.
I think I understand that, okay? All I'm saying is there's another effect in addition to this one. No? I mean,
What-
the other effect is just the allocational effect.
This QJ and QJ have nothing to do with the pre-merger allocation.
Yeah, but the gain, the decrease in costs after the merger is a result of two things. The cost function itself can shift,
Yes.
which is what you did,
Mhm.
okay? And there's an allocational effect.
Yeah, so that's what this is saying, that when you do the full equilibrium, unless
Okay.
this is
That's
true,
all I'm saying.
then prices are going to rise. Do you want to add something, Mike?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. So, it may be, what Ariel and you're thinking about is, we could reshuffle our output among our two factories at lower cost.
Yes.
The result is that can't, in the Cornell model, the merger of reducing price. You have to have more, some.
Yeah, so that would be, this is equal to that,
No.
and that's not
Now,
enough.
it could be that improves aggregate surplus, but what the result is saying is that it's not going to improve things for consumers. That's all that's going on.
Okay.
Okay, so that's about prices, so that is an implication for consumer surplus, but there is a question, could it increase total welfare? Okay, so one point they make, which is, this point was made in 1980, sort of pre-BLP. I don't know when you guys started working on BLP exactly, but it was before BLP was published, was that answering this question is actually quite difficult, okay, even in this simple framework, okay, which suggests a role for answering analytically, let me say, okay, which suggests a role for computational empirical analysis to capture the real world richness that's not captured in the simple framework. So I think is intellectually partly what led to BLP and so on. Okay, so their main results so the main result is proposition 5. Let's just read it through. Consider a proposed merger among some subset of firms, could be 2, could be more than 2, and suppose that their initial joint market share, okay, does not exceed this. And we're going to talk about, this is a weighted sum of market shares weighted by lambdas. We're going to look at what those weights are. Okay, then there's these conditions on prices and costs, which are, about third derivatives, sort of a little bit hard to think about, but that make this proposition hold. Okay, then they say if the merger is profitable, so the two firms want to do it, okay, and it would raise the market price, it would also raise welfare. Okay, so it really boils, we got to understand what these lambdas are and what these different conditions are. Okay, so let's look at the lambdas. Okay, so here's the definition of lambda. It's a function of firm I's market share, okay, and so capital E is the elasticity of the slope of the inverse demand curve. Okay, that's where those second derivatives are coming in, and then this is the mu I is the elasticity of the marginal cost of firm I. Okay, so in one simple case, or the textbook case, is that linear demand and constant marginal cost, lambda I is equal to 1. Okay, so there it's easy to think about if all the lambda i's are equal to 1. Okay, then it's got to be that the joint market share does not exceed the sum of the outsiders' market shares. Okay, so as long as the combining unit is less than half the market, okay, then you're going to be, it's going to raise total welfare.
But not necessarily consumer welfare.
Not necessarily consumer welfare. Yeah, this is about total welfare. Okay. I don't know, as an economist, I always think we should be maximizing social welfare, but for some reason in the in the merger, I think there are models where it says even in a dynamic world, even if you want to maximize social welfare, it's like you can. But this theorem's about social welfare. Okay, so the one robust intuition from this is the bigger the shares of the emerging firms, the less likely it's going to be good for total welfare. Okay, so these, let's see, for the sake of time, let me not talk about these conditions. Some of these are violated if there's capacity constraints and so on. It's a pretty special setup. Yeah, please.
Might be a more general question, but about social welfare. But aren't when we're maximizing consumer welfare, it's in utility and profits of firms, it's nominal eventually. So how can, when all the time when we maximize, when we add them up, how is it possible to compare them?
Yeah, so basically through the demand function, you can compare them. It assigns a willingness to, it translates preferences into willingness to pay for the products. And you can put a dollar value on the consumer's welfare before and after. There's some markets where you can't do that, like in school choice where there's no money being exchanged. You can't put it into dollars. But if consumers are paying for stuff, then you can put it into dollars typically.
So,
Yes?
so you said your conclusion was that if more firms merge, it becomes less likely that welfare will increase?
Yes, so we need this to be not exceed the outsiders thing. So if the merging firms are really big, it's going to exceed the outsiders' shares. Okay. So they probably wouldn't like this interpretation, but what I like about this paper is it shows how difficult it is to do stuff analytically. Okay, it suggests that, it formalizes the Williamson trade-off, which is nice, but it sort of suggests to me like this, for policy, it's not the right world to be living. We get some intuitions from here, but looking at it like this is not gonna take us a long way. It's sort of what people were doing before BLP. Okay, so where things went, and I wasn't around for this, so but my understanding of where things went was after this paper. So BLP is the demand estimation, and combined with Nash pricing was becoming increasingly prominent. That gave you a way to simulate mergers in a setting that's much more general than the fellowship. You can have differentiated products. You can think about adding and dropping products, rich demand systems with heterogeneity, and furthermore, you can infer. It gave you a way to infer those parameters from observed market data. Okay, so here's where I think that the triangle, measuring the triangle, is a bit easier than measuring the rectangle. Okay, because we have all this data on the demand function, which gives us a lot of information about the triangle. Okay, so lots of academic work was obviously done in this vein, but I would argue it's sort of the called standard in policy work, at least in the U.S. and Europe now as well. Okay, I'd say that the current frontier is about making it even more realistic. Okay, adding dynamics, which haven't really gone into the policy world as much. Bargaining, okay, we talked a ton about that. Product assortment, Alon will talk about that. Investment, which is, I think, our Achilles heel of merger analysis, and post-merger conduct, which is to say, one thing people worry about after mergers is that collusion increases. Okay, so we're going to look at empirical papers that are about this stuff. That's the current frontier of research. That's what I want to say about merger control. Now, within antitrust, okay, so remember there's umbrellas of regulation. One of them is antitrust. There's merger control, then there's collusion. Okay, and we're going to talk about a canonical model there, which is the Green and Porter model. It's basically a version of the repeated prisoner's dilemma with private information. Okay, so the starting point, just think of a repeated prisoner's dilemma. Two firms are competing. They'd be better off if they could coordinate on setting high prices. There's an incentive problem because each firm wants to cheat on that coordination and get the whole market. And absent an enforceable agreement, okay, and my understanding is there were countries that enforced collusive agreements historically. You would need something like repeated interaction to sustain cooperation. Now, and so the idea there is if we're repeating, then if I catch you cheating, then I can punish you, and that's going to make it not worth cheating. But that becomes more difficult. There's unobservable shocks. Okay, so if I see how would I notice cheating is if there's a low market price or I see you produce a lot. Okay, if that's hard to observe, okay, then if I see like a low market price and I'm not sure, is it because they cheated? Is it because the market was different? Okay, so you need some analysis to get the conditions under which you can sustain collusion. Okay, which is what the Green and Porter model does. Okay, so again, it's an N-firm Cournot oligopoly. Okay, so pretty simple setup. The twist is that were there no uncertainty, it would be you have the same inverse demand curve, but every period there's going to be a shock which sort of noises up the price. Okay, so theta t. Okay, so it could be that they didn't cheat, but theta t was low, so you see a low price and you're not sure what's going on. Okay. Okay, so the question is, can you get collusion? Can you sustain collusion in this model? Okay, firms are maximizing expected discounted sum of profits. They're able to condition their play on the previous industry prices and their own previous outputs. Okay, so they can do the whole history of industry prices. Okay, which is going to be different than some of the models we'll look at later, which means there's going to be a potentially very large state space. Okay, so what they show is an equilibrium is the following trigger strategy equilibrium. Okay, which is they're going to divide periods into what they call normal and reversionary. Okay, and give conditions for when we call a period normal. Okay, in a normal period, you're going to produce a level of output below the static Cournot outputs. That's the cooperative period. Okay, so that's where you're going to raise prices above the competitive level. Okay, not necessarily the monopoly level, but above the competitive level. Okay, and in a reversionary period, you're going to produce at the Cournot output. That's the bad situation. That's where you're punishing the other firm. Okay. Okay, so a period T is normal. Okay, where you're cooperating if you're in the 0th period, so you just started, okay, or if the previous period was normal and the price I observed last period exceeds some equilibrium cutoff rule. Okay, so this is like the price was high enough that I'm not worried that you were cheating. Okay, this p-bar is determined as a function of the parameters of the underlying model. Okay, or if capital T periods ago, okay, also determined by the parameters of the model, was normal, okay, and I was in, and I see a low price. Okay, so the idea here is that I saw a low price that made me wonder whether the other firm cheated. Okay, even though I'm not in principle not exactly sure, I'm going to punish. Okay, and I'm going to punish for capital T periods, but after capital T periods, I'm going to go back to normal. Okay, because I don't want to punish forever. I want to be cooperating. Okay, so they show that that's an equilibrium, and how high of a cooperative price you can sustain is a function of how patient the agents are, the firms are. Okay, with more patient, you can get more cooperation. Okay. One implication of this model that price wars, even though they're a threat, they actually happen in equilibrium. Okay, if you get a low enough realization of theta t, okay, and actually the firm in the equilibrium, they kind of know that the other firm didn't cheat because the other firm is following this strategy. Okay, but to make this strategy in equilibrium, it has to be that they punish when they see that low price. Yes?
So when the clarification of this yi, could it be equal to monopoly share, or is it always a bit above that?
So it depends on the patients. The more patient they get, the closer you can get to the monopoly.
Under some parameter conditions, it could be equal to the monopoly share.
Yes, I think it's in the limit. Yeah, actually, I'm outside my, not 100% sure if it's only in the limit or not. Yep.
Can't t be normal if t minus 1 is reversionary, but like can't you go back to normal once you start?
This is the going back. So here in these capital T periods between t minus t and t, you are in the reversionary. So you're like punishing them for capital T periods, then you go back. Okay, so this is like my starting point for thinking about collusion. Then there's a bunch of theory papers on what if you can observe this and not that, and what if you can communicate, not communicate. And I'd say the empirical work is much more sparse. Let's put it like that. But we'll look at some papers. Okay, these two things are related. I alluded to this earlier. In merger policy, you'll hear people distinguish between unilateral and coordinated effects of a merger. Okay, the unilateral effects, that's all the stuff we talked about, the firms changing price, changing their allocation of where they produce which factories they produce the products. Okay, the idea of coordinated effects is that somehow when the merger happens, changes the number of firms in this world and makes it easier to sustain the cooperation. That's not explicit in this model, at least not as I haven't told you what these depend on. Okay, but you might think like if we're able to communicate, and there's fewer firms, it might be easier. It could be harder. Okay, the theory is actually pretty rich there. It's kind of like the vertical relations theory, which Mike made seem really simple, but if you go to look at the papers, there's like a ton of papers. That's with all different assumptions and different results. I'd say that's kind of true for the collusion and communication as well. Okay, John and we'll talk about empirical evidence on coordinated effects of mergers. Okay, so there's a few empirical papers where they estimate a model of what should happen after the merger. Okay, they see that price went up by more than that. Okay, and they try to figure out, is that something about coordinated effects after the merger? Okay. Okay, so yes.
So maybe the question of the theory would be that collusion would be between the most patient firms, right?
The gains would be highest amongst the most patient. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. The question is an implication of the theory that if you were to predict the set of firms colluding, it would be the most patient firms. So imagine you observe patience of each firm. Could you test the theory by looking at when cartels are caught, is it the patient firms? Yeah. So you need a measure of patience. It sounds right to me. I'm not confident enough to know if that's actually the gains would be high. Like you'd be able to support the highest collusive price the more patient the firms are. In this model, I'd probably bet it's true, but yeah.
The patient is captured by the discount rate?
Yeah, so this beta being closer to 1. Okay, so now we're going to a different umbrella. So regulation, there was antitrust with mergers and collusion, and we're going to go to natural monopoly regulation. Okay. So the main rationale, so why would the government ever tell an industry like you can set this price, you have to invest this much? The main rationale in modern economies is that there's some economies of scale that make it such that it's efficient for one firm to produce all the output. Okay, so that's what they mean by natural monopoly. So if you think about where do we see this, electricity, water, they're saying it would be wasteful to have 2 sets of power lines on the same street. Okay, we shouldn't do that. Rather than having 2 sets of power lines and letting them compete on price, let's have 1 set of power lines, but regulate the price they can charge. Okay. So there's certain industries where people have accepted that. That tends to change slowly over time. So people thought that about electricity generation, but technology changed in a way that they changed their thinking about that. Right now, for power lines, water and gas pipes in the US, that's how it works. Okay, so they're saying it'd be wasteful to have 2 sets of power lines, though we don't think it's wasteful to have 2 grocery stores or 2 hotels because of, presumably because of product differentiation and so on. Okay, so let's accept the premise that about the costs. You can't just say there's going to be one firm and then let them do whatever they want, because then you're going to get way too high prices. Okay, so we're going to have this trade where we're going to grant a monopoly franchise to provide the service, but then control what they do. Okay. Now, controlling what they do is difficult, and here's 2 primary reasons. One is about asymmetric information. That's the firm you're trying to control what they do. They understand the game they're playing better than you do. Okay, they know their cost conditions, they might know their demand conditions better. They might be able to hide stuff that they're doing. Okay, that sort of makes it difficult for the regulator to achieve what they want. Okay, and the other one we'll talk about is the inability in a dynamic world to commit to policies. One side note, so if you like the history of this stuff, I recommend this book called Profits of Regulation. Won a Pulitzer Prize for history. They talk about where all this stuff came from, how it has a common history. One chapter on Alfred Kahn, who was an economist who became a regulator, is responsible for a lot of the theory here. Okay, so a canonical model in the asymmetric information world is the Barron and Meyerson model. So it's one of the first applications, in quotes, of mechanism design theory. Okay, application in the sense that it's gonna be fairly stylized with cost functions and so on, but it's like a specific use of mechanism designed to a specific problem. Okay, it's an adverse selection problem. So within asymmetric information, there's moral hazard and adverse selection. It's adverse selection that the firm knows its cost structure better than the regulator. That's sort of fixed ex ante. Okay. Regulators choosing an incentive scheme to offer the firm to maximize social welfare. Okay, so the firm's cost function depends on how much they produce and a productivity parameter theta. Okay, theta can affect both their marginal costs and their fixed costs. Okay. And theta is only known to the firm being regulated. What the regulator knows is that it lives in this interval, closed and bounded interval, and they have some prior distribution over that. Okay. Consumers have an inverse demand function, P of Q, pretty general, but it's a single product. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so general for being a single product, and you can compute consumer surplus as a function of how much is produced. Okay, so that's V of Q is consumer surplus. They're going to let the regulator choose a set of functions. Okay, the way they're going to set this up is they're going to say the regulator is going to ask the firm what its cost is. Okay, and depending on that, what the firm reports as its cost, its theta, they're going to say, okay, with that report, you can charge this price. I'm going to write you a check for this transfer. Okay, and I'm also going to give you a a probability of operating. You can think of this in this world as being 0, 1. You either get to function or you don't function. Okay. Okay. Now, without getting into the world of mechanism design, which I'm not qualified to speak deeply about, the one thing that simplifies this problem is the revelation principle. Okay, so we can restrict attention to schemes where we just ask the firm what is their cost and make sure we put in incentives that they tell the truth. Okay, so the regulator's objective function is the following. They're going to integrate over their this is the regulators. Okay, so pi r for regulator. They're going to integrate over the range of the productivity, care about consumer surplus minus the so this is consumer surplus. That's consumer value minus how much they have to pay for the goods. This is the probability of operating. Okay, so it's only get the consumer surplus if the firm is operating. That's the check they write, the subsidy. Okay, and then this is alpha is a preference parameter for the regulator. It's how much do they weight firm profits versus consumer surplus. Okay, so alpha you could think of as being determined. So if it's social welfare, it'd be equal. You could think if there's a regulator who favors firms, they could raise alpha. Okay, if there's regulators very consumer driven, they could lower alpha. Okay, it could be a function of politics of the regulator. Okay, and here's the firm's profit. So how much money they get from producing P times Q minus their cost. Okay, which is specified on the previous slide. Okay, so the regulator is choosing the functions R, P, and Q. Okay, which are functions of what the utility reports its costs being. Okay, so as a benchmark, let's think about, were there no asymmetric information, how would you regulate this firm? Okay, it's pretty simple. You set price equal to marginal cost. So here they tell you theta and it's correct. Okay, so that's condition of efficiency. That implies how much they're going to produce. They operate if the value of producing exceeds the fixed cost. Okay, and they don't operate otherwise. And then you pay them just enough to cover their fixed cost. Okay, but clearly that's not going to be incentive compatible if there's private information. Okay, because they get a higher price if they report a higher theta. Okay, so in this scheme, this is not optimal because the firm will just say my theta is in theta 1 upper bound and raise its price as high as possible. Okay, so they set up the problem to do this maximization where the theta hat that's reported, they give incentives to make that truthful. Okay, and the solution to that problem revolves around this following function. Okay, the z function of theta, which has an element that's increasing in theta, okay, but also this element that can be decreasing in theta.
Like a virtual value, right?
Like a virtual value, yep. So virtual value is something that comes up a lot in mechanism design that tells you how much you have to sort of shave what you give the agent to make things incentive compatible. Okay, so here's the optimal solution. I'm not going to go into the proof. Okay, so you give them a price which is equal to C0 plus C1 times the Z hat, which is closely related to function to this. There's some technical issues to make this thing non-decreasing. But it looks like this. Okay, so it's non-decreasing in theta. So you can report a higher theta, you're going to get a higher price. Okay, but the reason you don't do it is because it's going to lower your subsidy. So this big subsidy function, okay, which is a function of many different things, is actually decreasing in your reported theta in the relevant ranges. Okay, so this gets it that you can report a higher cost, but you're going to get a bit less subsidy. Okay, so it gives incentives to tell the truth about your costs. Okay, and that ends up leaving some money on the table for the firm. They enjoy an information rent, which keeps you away from the first best, right? This is the first best. Okay, but that's what you got to give up to the firm. That's the best you can do as the regulator. Okay, so that's an example where asymmetric information kees you from achieving first best. Now, when we get to the empirical papers on Sunday about this, there's going to be different takes on how to think. There's going to be some papers that say this is optimal, and we're going to assume that's what regulators are doing in practice because it's optimal, and they're going to use these conditions to back out the primitives of what's going on. Okay? There's going to be other papers that say, we don't think regulators actually do this. Either they can't figure it out or we don't observe transfers. Okay, and we're going to, based on what they actually do, we're going to back out underlying firm parameters, and then we're going to say how much better could the regulator do were they to do this. Okay, we'll see both types of paper.
I don't understand. Why do you back out parameters according to the behavior of a regulator which does not actually take place? I'm asking about the first approach.
Well, that's one philosophy. You could say this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And
if you know it doesn't happen, what's the
if you know it doesn't happen, then
Well, what's
it doesn't make
the
sense. But they're going to
exercise?
say we think it happens is what they would
You
say.
can actually check it. You can probably get information about what the regulator actually does.
Yeah, but it's not so easy to map that into a decision of this happens or doesn't happen, because that's a big process. You know, the many different. This is all approximation. To say, you could take the stand that when all is said and done, what it ends up looking like this. Right? This is true of any. This is true in just. Yeah, like we assume firms are maximizing stuff and back out stuff, and that we're not sure if that actually happens or not either.
But presumably you have more information about what the regulator actually does. Presumably that's more transparent.
I don't think it's more. I wouldn't say it's more transparent because it's very complicated. The outcome of these regulations, it's not like they say here's our P function, here's our. It's like a document that says you can charge industrial customers in this county this much, and you can invest this much, and it's hard to do that mapping. They're saying as an approximation because this is what's optimal. Let's say, I'm trying to defend what they're. I'm more sympathetic to your position, which is like unlikely this is what comes out, but I can't say we can show that conclusively. Okay, so another difficulty for the regulators is that these things unfold over time, and there's a commitment problem. Okay, so commitment we usually think of, I don't know, central banking or maybe entry deterrence, something like that. Okay, but it's acute in regulation as well. Okay, there's another sort of narrative Williamson paper cited, but the idea is really subgame perfection. Okay, so think about, I wish I should have brought the picture. So one thing I don't like about the neighborhood I live in, is very uncommon in Europe, is that the power lines are all above ground and it's really ugly. There's like 15 different power lines that all, and if there's a storm, they break. And you think like, okay, say we ask the utility to bury all those power lines. Okay, like if you go to Germany, every town, power lines are underground. It's beautiful, nothing goes out of, okay, it's costly to do that. You got to dig and put the power lines underneath. And if you're a regulator, you don't control your price, the utility. So if the regulator comes to you and says, hey, utility, bury all your power lines, we'll make it worth your while. Okay, then you bury the power lines, and they're already buried. Okay, you can lower the price on the utility. Okay, that's the commitment problem. Okay, and then the utility's not an idiot. They realize that, so they don't bury the power lines to begin with. Okay. Okay, so it's a pretty simple idea. I'll show you a paper. There's one paper I worked on that explores that idea in electric. Yep.
So if, in practice, regulation cannot be done contractually, the government can't have a contract with the monopolist saying, we promise you these prices, that's not enforceable.
It's complicated, actually. So there's,
But you would think that would be better than
yeah,
nothing.
that's right. If you could actually write that contract, but a new government comes in the next.
And repudiates it.
Yeah, it can happen. There's been court cases where it's been decided both ways. It's one of those things like whatever the judge decides, but there's no real. In practice, it doesn't happen in electric utilities. There was a case where the government ordered a bunch of food for the military, and then government changed over and they canceled the order. That went to the Supreme Court, and there they had to pay the food provider. Okay, but in electric utilities, you don't actually have like, we're going to indefinitely promise you this amount of prices. Those things get set for a few years, but then are reset later. You have no control over the reset later.
And that's a problem with court enforcement.
court enforcements, yeah. So in the US, it's probably less of a problem. It's also very acute in developing countries. So the literature on this is bigger in developing countries. Okay, where anything goes.
So this the problem is equivalent to saying that since the property rights are not well defined and things are not enforceable in the court, that's why it's not.
Yeah, ultimately it's about incomplete contracts. Okay, which is true for a lot of this stuff we're studying. Like, can be solved by very complex contracts. But I think it's realistic here is what I'm.
So just an example in India, so it's like there is a metro built by a company and government promises to pay that much price for this much year, so it's working fine. That's maybe one example where contract does work.
Yeah, look, I'm not saying this happens in every single case. Clearly we see, things get built, okay, and there are things built into the regulatory contract, like the social contract, that you have to give a fair rate of return, but fair is ambiguous. And then, so I'm not trying to say that like this leads to no investments ever being made. It just might limit. We're going to try to measure how much it limits those investments. Okay, and let me just say this is quite different than the undergraduate intuition you get about regulated. In undergraduate courses, you get this average Johnson effect. The idea is like, if you're a regulated firm, you get paid a return on your capital base. If you're able to borrow at a rate that's cheaper than the return you can get, then you like borrow an infinite amount and you overinvest in capital. So a lot of the intuition is like there's too much investment in regulated firms. But I'd say if you look at the academic literature and the practitioner literature, it's people worry more about the previous thing, that we're not getting the right amount of investment. Like you think about the post office or your local electricity firm or cable when it was regulated, like the worry was that we're not innovating fast enough, not that they're gold plating everything. I guess the way to reconcile is once you the thing that this doesn't account for is that the return is chosen endogenously by a regulator who has their own incentives. Okay, environmental regulation, the theory is not much to say. It's, the canonical theory is essentially micro 101. Okay, you want a Pigovian taxation or something equivalent like cap and trade. Okay, make it expensive to pollute. It does get interesting, like once you combine this with things like market power, asymmetric information, political constraints, it gets more interesting. Okay, so we'll look at, I'm not going to go through any theory model here, okay, but we will look at papers that combine these with like cap and trade systems and think about measuring outcomes there.
Give me a summary. Can I ask a question? So I was struck by the fact that you talked about the trade-off between efficiency and when you did merger analysis, but you didn't talk about it when you do collusion. So collusion can be good and can be bad. It's in a same kind of dynamic thing. And why?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I agree with you. So I'd say I'm reflecting the accepted wisdom. Like people think of collusion, are sort of more automatically think it's bad than merger. I think that's just this is an empirical statement about how people think about it.
It wasn't always true, right?
I don't know.
There were times in England that you could actually register a collusive agreement. It was in the country's interest. In fact, formally it was a rule of reason, not per se.
Is that right? Yeah. I think there's,
There's dynamics you could, just think of a duopoly.
I'm not just.
You couldn't.
Okay, so the question is. Yeah. Let me and there's a simpler version of that. Let me repeat the question so everyone. Okay, so the question was when I was talking about merger control, I was talking about trade-off between good stuff and bad stuff. Okay, when I talked about collusion, it was all bad, right? If they colluded, it was good for the firms or bad for the consumers. Okay, and Ariel's question was, well, what about efficiencies from collusion? Okay, and there is a very basic efficiency, which is they can reshuffle production, like even before investment, right? They can just produce they can allocate production to the lowest cost factories, which would be good. And part of my response is, the way people talk about this, usually people don't go there in their heads first, usually think of collusion as being bad. I'm not sure if that's because the cases that get brought, it's sort of, in practice, it turned out to be more bad than good. I don't feel like I know enough to talk. In theory, it can be good. Yeah.
Maybe you less expect cost functions to change. I mean, would more affect prices than melters. Melters would also affect the cost functions, which yields the efficiency.
Can I just say one thing? I think the basic argument is dynamic. So, you could have, R&D facilities growing, you could have.
Okay, there are some cooperative arrangements between firms which are allowed,
Yes.
like joint ventures for R&D. So those happen. I wouldn't call those collusion, though. It is a cooperative.
They're cooperative,
Yeah.
but the collusive agreements can be good too. I mean,
Yeah. So here So here by collusion I meant.
Distinguishing between collusion and cooperation.
So collusion would be separate firms. that-
Sorry, the question was, how are you distinguishing between collusion and cooperation? I think it's a semantic.
Try and answer that.
Yeah, please.
I think one would go to cooperate. You have to go through the Federal Trade Commission or the DOJ and get a venture done. And my collusive agreement would be, there's some agreement between the firms that didn't go through the government agencies and that they can actually prosecute later if they want.
Yeah, though your England example, they do go through the government.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, they did. That's true. So, I brought up the English example because it was there because they
Mhm.
knew that. If you talk to firms, they often say competition can be destructive, and sometimes they're right.
I don't know if John will talk about his paper. He has his paper on the OPEC cartel, okay, where there's benefits from collusion that they might produce the oil in
That's true.
lower cost. Yeah, Mike, please.
Just saying one thing about this. I think in the law, it's, you're shown to be colluding, it's just you're automatically guilty. We're not going to look
Per
at
se.
whether the U.S. is called per se illegal. We're not going to look at whether you're, we're not going to study carefully whether your collusive scheme is good or bad. And that's part of, I think the reflection that Ali was having of talking about it only the bad side. I think it isn't that it can't be good. It's that when you're thinking about implementation of the law, it's costly to adjudicate these cases. And there's some Bayesian decision, and that you can think of it as a Bayesian decision problem. And if you see you're doing a certain class of activities, collusion, you think the probability is high, it's bad. It may be good, but the probability is high, it's bad. We shouldn't go further.
Yeah, but if you
Now,
look-
it may turn out that Ariel is going to produce several papers that are going to show us that that's wrong.
Can I just say, no, but you did make this distinction because in mergers, which could be bad or could be good, we actually go to the data and
Yeah,
try
but I
to
think it's
decide.
because right.
And-
I think it's because we have a different prior.
I agree with that, but I thought it was worth discussing.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I should have.
But just,
Yep.
if a collusive agreement could be good for consumers, not just the firms, you were suggesting before, well, that could go through the government, that could go through the
I
regulator.
couldn't in the United States, but it could, in prior times in England, it would have gone through.
Maybe not.
Well,
Okay, let me-
Register.
Okay, I
I
think
mean, they could
But
formally
it's
register
interesting,
it, and
the
that.
very first Supreme Court case on collusion after
I
the
should know
Sherman
more
Act
about this.
was a railroad collusive case where the railroads were arguing that if you didn't allow collusion, if you disrupted competition, then you'd end up with monopoly. And we know that in principle, that could happen, right? And so the courts actually had to sort through whether they were going to start to try to figure out whether that was, could actually happen. Should they listen to the justification? I think the usual argument is colluders can always come up with some clever argument and hire an economist to say it, but it's not worth looking at most of the time, almost all the time.
Good. Thank you for bringing that up. I should say on cooperation. There's another, related to yesterday, there's another type of cooperation that's sometimes allowed, which is joint purchasing. Okay, that you can, as buyers of a product, you can go to the government and say, can we negotiate together? And in some cases that's allowed, like for some hospital supplies. Okay.
Also, if you're a labor union.
Labor unions have they have an antitrust exemption, I believe. Yeah. Yes, please.
So, and may it be correct that this distinction is because when we look at consumer surplus and welfare, looking at both sides, so producers and consumers, so collusion is always bad for consumers.
No, Ariel's point, I think is correct, is that it can be good for consumers even, if it lowers costs or it increases innovation.
Collusion is defined in this case because of joint buying and R&D. It all relates to production, to costs of production. But collusion, as it like colloquially understood, is just pricing behavior, and it affects pricing and.
So I'm going to channel Ariel just for the sake of time, which I think is the idea. You could even get it if it raises prices and somehow higher prices lead to better investment or products. Okay, I think it's theoretically possible. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the cable industry. I'm not going to talk about the same stuff Robin did for the most part. I just want to show you how like all these different things have hit this industry over time, so you could see it all coming together. So they've had economic regulation, both at the federal and local level. The federal one was quite severe. So for a period of 4 years in the 90s, prices were capped in the cable TV industry. Okay, so we'll talk about that. And there's been a ton of big merger cases, both horizontal and vertical. We'll look at some of those. And there's been a little bit of collusion cases also. Okay. So Robin went through the structure yesterday. So there we were focused, the upstream firms were TV channels, downstream firms were distribution. Okay, this came up briefly. There's also another level above, which are the TV studios who produce programs. And there's integration sort of up and down here. And then you have the hardware, which is complementary, and there's integration there. Like Sony's a big TV studio and a big hardware provider. So it's a complicated sector. And this is the level which people say is like, at least in the past had said was like a natural monopoly, the distribution sector. Okay, it's like a electric power system. You have the generation of content somewhere off-site, okay, and gets delivered to houses via wires. Okay, so those wires often are hung with the power lines or sometimes underground. Okay. So cable actually started pretty early, like in the 50s. It was just a way to get the broadcast signal to places that didn't have a line of sight. People were going around the country building out cable systems, and they had sort of this natural monopoly structure. They'd strike a deal with the local city saying, let us be the monopoly cable provider, and we'll pay you some fraction of our revenue, typically between 3 and 7. Okay, and that depended on how many people were trying to get the franchise. Okay, so many small cable systems, mom and pop, these were like startups in the 70s. Okay, and then there was no HBO, there was no national programming because the satellites didn't exist. Everything had to be made locally and then sent locally, pretty much. Okay, but there was a sense actually that this was going to be more than just rebroadcasting local signals. I found this article which I just want to share. This is from 1973. Okay, these were cable systems that were built in a few communities around the U.S. where they actually had two-way communication. So you could send emails, you could order pizzas, you could make doctor's appointments. Okay, so you basically had mini internets in 1973. But it wasn't widespread. Yeah, I mean this was just at households. Yeah, I know internet was sort of in its infancy, I'd say then. But these were systems that were connected within a city, but not connected across cities. And also the complementary hardware wasn't very elegant. There were no PCs or anything like that. Okay, so it's this industry that people had a sense was going to be more than just rebroadcasting signals. Okay, so the satellites in the 1980s, you saw the industry took off. You had the HBOs, ESPNs, like everything went up. Content, prices, market shares. And prices were going up sometimes 50% from year to year. Okay, and so people were looking at that. They said, well, these guys are like monopolies. Prices are going up like crazy. There was actually Republicans were pushing for cable TV regulation. Okay. And that's what happened in 1992. The Cable TV Act effectively capped prices to consumers and the FCC was the regulator in charge. So the FCC said you could charge this price, and they tried to benchmark against some systems where there's something like competition. There are some academic papers that looked at this federal rate regulation, trying to figure out was it good or bad. I'd say these weren't conclusive at all. And what it boiled down to was, okay, prices did level off during this period. So this is prices over time. That's the CPI, urban CPI, and this is the cable part of that index. Okay, so this is going up like crazy during this time period. Okay, and then here's the regulation in here. So it does flatten out. Okay, but at the same time, the number of channels that were being provided also slowed down then. Okay, so it's all about measuring, like, does that decrease in price offset the increase in channels? And nobody's really done it properly. Greg Crawford, my co-author, he tried to do it, just he didn't have good data. It turned out that he had data only on a subset of systems. On those systems, the prices actually went up. And it was like they sort of behaved like they were unregulated, even though on average they were flat. So he didn't have the data to look at it properly. Okay, technology was changing. So in addition to satellites transmitting things to cable systems, they also started transmitting stuff to people's houses. Okay, so there was more competition in the late 90s that made the government sort of get rid of all these regulations. They said, along with deregulating telephone industry, they said no more cable regulation. Okay, and then things went sort of back onto that path. You can see, yes, please. Yeah, so here it's basically a fixed cost industry. So for consumer welfare, we weren't really thinking about those. Like once the content's made, delivering it basically free.
I'm wondering, maybe because of the competition, I have to make more shows, more programs, more channels.
Yeah, that's a dimension nobody's studied. There is data on that. Okay, I'm trying to work on that, but yeah, the further back you go, the spottier the data gets. Okay, so this is total market share in blue. It was all cable until the mid-90s. Then you have the satellite companies coming in. Those are these guys taking off down here. Okay, so deregulation anticipated that. They also anticipated that the phone companies would overbuild the cable systems. Okay, so they deregulated in anticipating competition. And like you said, prices continued to rise, but the number of shows rose like crazy too. Okay, so quality is going up. And how much people were watching was also going up during this period. Okay, so it's another quantity measure. Okay, so there's a question like, should there have been regulation and so on, which we don't know.
What, this is what? This is average?
Yeah.
You're serious?
Yeah, no, economists don't watch a lot of TV.
4.5 hours a day watching?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But it's not necessarily that
It's amazing.
Okay, this is actually not as easy to measure as you think because there's costly ways to measure where people say I'm watching now and they press a button, but there it's sort of subject to the people answering. And then there's other ways where you measure passively through the equipment, but there, like if I turn it on, go cook dinner, come back, and you're sort of over it. So, but yeah, 3 to 5 you should think about the range.
or just keep it on the whole day, so it's like
Yeah, background, there's how much attention you're paying. Okay, but this is what people use for the US. And Europe's not that different, to be honest. Okay. So one interesting thing that happened here was a proposed horizontal merger was, so here are the satellites, 2 firms entered, DirecTV and Dish Network. Okay, these were the rivals that when Robin was talking about the RSNs, these were the firms that were not getting the content. Okay. So they were growing, providing some competition to cable, and they were actually a higher quality product than they could transmit more channels than the cable company. And in 2001, they said, let's merge. Okay, so there was a merger case where DirecTV was going to sell its business to Dish Network, which would be a merger from 3 to 2. You'd think typically they wouldn't try such a merger. And the DOJ sued to block. FCC also had jurisdiction because they had to get FCC permission to use do the satellites. Okay, so a merger from 3 to 2. Let's see, in an unpopular industry. Okay, what they argue was that there'd be large efficiencies that lead to quality improvements. Okay, so the way to think about it is like each one of these firms, think about there being a pipe from the satellite to the home. Okay, and the channels are getting sent through that pipe, and they're saying our pipes are duplicating the same content. Like they're sending ABC, we're sending ABC, they're sending ESPN, we're sending ESPN. Let's combine our pipes. We can send the content we're duplicating, still send that, but we can also send a bunch more content. It's not a crazy argument. I think it's a perfectly fine argument. That's the efficiency argument. It's actually very similar to arguments being made in mobile telecom right now, that if three firms, having 3 strong competitors is better than having 2 strong and 2 weak. And like I said earlier, I think this is really the Achilles heel of our analysis, is that we don't do a good job predicting this stuff. It's hard because it's hard. It's not, it's not that we're not trying, but it's difficult. There's just not as much data on technological progress, and stuff changes over time so much. It's hard to get a handle on it. The other argument they made, which should be familiar, is that when they're bigger, they're going to be able to negotiate lower programming costs. Okay, so they'd be able to squeeze suppliers, and that would be good for consumers. They pass those savings on to consumers, which is also a valid argument. I think there's an add-on effect to what does that mean for investment in the content. Okay, so what I'm trying to convey here is that it gets really complicated when you think of investment. This is like where I think people ought to be working, and put my money where my mouth is. That's what I'm working on these days too. So DOJ and a bunch of states sued to block. FCC also said they were going to block. They didn't go to trial. The parties basically folded right away. They said, okay, we're not going to do it. And then DirecTV was later acquired in a vertical merger by the News Corporation. There's been a lot of big vertical merger cases. Robin talked about the economics there. I just want to mention this one that happened a few weeks ago, or the decision was a few weeks ago. I just want to make 2 points. One is that, so when Comcast bought NBC, okay, the government allowed that merger with a bunch of what they call conditions. Okay, it said you have to offer your content to rival what were the program access rules in the paper yesterday. Okay, so it was a merger with conditions. The new administration for AT&T Time Warner, they said, to a first approximation, we don't want to do conditions anymore. We're going to change merger policy that we don't want to do conditions, because doing conditions makes us like an industry regulator. Then we got to make sure you're adhering to the conditions. We got to enforce. We got to learn the details of the industry, and that's not what we're about. Okay, which I think is a intellectually valid position to take. I mean, here there is other considerations, which is my second point, which is one of the impediments to regulation is political incentives. Okay, and in this case, because CNN was involved in the merger, it's hard to rule out that, and the current president was talking about how he's not going to let the merger through because CNN's fake news. It's hard to rule out that this challenge was politically driven. Okay, and that's an aspect that hasn't been examined a lot, sort of how this is examined more in the economic regulation case, how politics affects regulation. We're going to look at that. Okay, but how politics affects merger stuff hasn't been examined a lot. Maybe it wasn't as important until recently. Okay, interesting thing about cable broadband, even though they run on the same lines as the electricity, since the 90s, we basically said it's not it's not a natural monopoly. Okay, in fact, it's illegal to grant a monopoly. But only about half of the US has overbuilt cable systems. Now for video, it's not that big of a deal because you have the satellite providing competition, but for broadband, it's a big deal. So half the country only has like one good broadband provider. Okay, the other half has maybe 2, some markets have 3. Okay, but I always thought that was interesting, like why don't we have 2 power companies? Why is it we have one decision and one in the other when they're similar? The hope is that, and it's also true for cell phone networks too, right? We don't consider that a natural monopoly, even though it's got big fixed costs. There's some hope that 5G will sort of eliminate this issue. Okay, I have 5 minutes. So I want to come back to this point about the DirecTV Dish merger, where they claimed efficiencies on lowering input costs to the bargaining type thing. We talked about that yesterday. This is a argument that's brought up regularly. Okay, so it came up in this Charter Time. This was another huge merger. We're talking like $30-40 billion mergers, each one of these. Okay, and it's hard to keep track of all the firms merging with each other. Okay, prior to AT&T buying Time Warner, they bought DirecTV. Okay, so AT&T owns DirecTV now. Okay,
AT&T is a phone company, right?
AT&T was phone company, got broken up. It was a long distance, and now they got in the cable business. They got out. They got back in, and they bought the satellite company. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to talk about this fact that there are scale economies or scale effects in that larger cable firms get lower programming costs. That's just true in the industry. I'll show you evidence of that as well. Here's some quotes. One I like a lot. So this is Google, who is a content provider on the broadband side. They tried to build out their own broadband, and they said one issue we're facing is that when we try to offer a video product, which is what consumers expect with their broadband for the most part, we can't get the same prices that Comcast is getting. Okay, we're so much smaller, we don't have the scale, we end up paying double what they're paying for programming. That makes us not a good competitor. Okay, and then for new entrants, other new entrants like the over-the-top guys, in 2012, Intel said, we're going to come in, we're going to have, forget your cable guy, we're going to give you this high-tech product. And so there was a lot of hype about that, but a year later, they were not able to get good rates from the programmers. Okay, dreams are hampered by haggling over content, and then they killed that project. They just couldn't make it work economically. Okay, so I did some work with Nikolai Dowchenko, where we basically took a very similar model to the ones that Robin was talking about yesterday. We parameterized the bargaining power to be a function of two things. One is the total number of subscribers the downstream firm has, and time. Okay, because if you look at the pattern, let me explain what's going on here. Each one of these lines is over time for a firm, their revenue minus how much they pay to the content. So this is revenue to downstream firm minus how much they pay to the content divided by their video revenue. Okay, so the distributors want this to be big, and the content companies want this to be small. Okay, so the content's getting more of the revenue. Okay, what you see over time is that the distributors are getting less and less of the pie. Okay, so it's something like their bargaining power is going down over time. Then you have the lines that are higher up are smaller distributors. So big distributors get lower prices. Okay, that was what was being referenced in these quotes. As much as 30%, double, as much as double. This is data that the DOJ got in a merger proceeding. When the DOJ does the merger proceeding, they can demand data from the firms. Okay, so here they regressed how much you pay, how much a distributor pays based on how big the distributor is. Okay, and they get this elasticity. This is like you double the size of the distributor, you pay about 5% less programming fees. Your TAUs are 5% lower. Okay, so these economies exist, but the implication of them is actually not straightforward at all. So we estimated a model like the one Robin talked about. Okay, we match that increase over time of what's going to, these are the TAUs, the fees that are being paid. So more is going to the programmers. We get the differences by firm size, and then we do some simulations where we kill that effect, similar to Grennan, like kill the price discrimination. And we find there that it doesn't make that much difference. Okay, very small changes in consumer welfare, statistically a zero. We didn't calculate the standard errors yet. Okay, but the next thing we did was we said, okay, how would that affect the entry of AT&T to Verizon overbuilding additional markets? Okay, now that they could get lower prices, will they overbuild more markets? And when we do that, we see sort of bigger effects. Still not huge, okay, because they don't enter every market, but there are some markets they enter and have a really big effect. So that is, in the markets where they enter, consumer welfare goes up by a lot. Okay, because it's going from one competitor to two competitors. Okay, so to wrap up, so has there been collusion? There's also been collusion cases. There's one a few years ago, again, AT&T, DirecTV involved. Here they were accused of colluding as buyers. Okay, so they didn't go to the government and ask, can we negotiate together? the negotiators with DirecTV apparently were communicating with negotiators of other companies, okay, and saying, let's hold out and get a really low price for this LA regional sports network. Okay, so they were caught doing that. They ended up settling that case with basically nothing really happened. They said they would self-monitor. Okay, so collusion happens as well. The last thing I want to say, okay, there's not much environmental stuff in cable. I mean, the boxes do take some energy, but it's not a huge deal. And it comes to the question that was asked earlier about what about employment when you're thinking about mergers? So imagine you're a merger. You can calculate the consumer welfare effects like in the product market, but you don't know maybe it increases pollution. Okay, the question is like, should we take that into account? And there are similar issues in cable. It's not about pollution, but it's about things like, is there going to be a diversity of news channels? Like, should we let Fox News take over CNN? That sort of thing. And these are subtle effects which are hard to measure in our standard frameworks. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions like, how should regulators deal? What should the laws be about this stuff? Should we care about diversity of information? One thing that on the left in the U.S. is they say merger policy should think about inequality. I don't know. This is sort of a fuzzier area that hasn't really been. What's that? I can't hear you, sir. Yeah, well, there's actually research on that. Okay, so it's a good point. You might think television's bad for you and we should discourage it. Research is actually quite mixed in terms of learning new languages, spreading pro-social behavior in developing countries from urban areas to rural areas. So it's not obvious, despite, but the question is like, should we care about, like, are we qualified to deal with that? Should we deal with it in merger policy?
Well, I mean, the quality of information is clearly important, and information that has positive externalities. People know more about how their environment, that's very helpful in making positive changes.
Yeah, but then it's up to the regulators to say what's more information, what's better information. It's not easy to do, is what I'm saying. This is more food for thought. So let me.
That's usually the arguments for public TV.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Okay, so I'm out of time. So just to wrap up, what we did is we had these three umbrellas: antitrust, economic regulation, environmental regulation. I tried to go through some canonical theory models, like what do I first think about when I'm thinking about one of these things, and then showed you in the cable TV how they all sort of came up at different points in time.